November 9th. Yeah. Oh yeah, about the papers, folks. Let me ask you, those of you who know anything at all about modern English, when you're given a number like you say there were 723, should you spell it out and 23, or should you just say 723? You should spell it out. I was taught, now let me tell you, I was taught that when it was a number like 100, you spell it out, or 200, you spell it out, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you spell it out. When it's a longer number like 723, I was taught you put the figure down. Is that rule still in the books? You're all telling me, is that still in the books? The reason I ask that is grammar has changed a lot since I was in school, but I think, folk, that this is right.
If there's one significant figure, then you write it. And if there are more than one
If there's one significant figure like 100, you write it.
Yeah.
If there's more than one significant figure, that's what the rule was when I was younger, and I think, Bobby, I think that one's still in the books. Yeah, I think that one's still in the books. So okay, someone who I think knows. Yeah, okay, all right. Just rules, folks. I mean, hey. If you read things from the 15 and 1600s, those authors had no rules to go by. And every one of them made up their own rules as they went along. And I'll tell you, the book that did a lot to set rules, believe it or not, was the Bible itself. Gave the English language and other languages was written in a real literary form and set up rules that every writer is expected to abide by. All right, chapter 9. Expansion of civilization in Southern Asia. Your book opens up with a chapter with a vignette about how in India the dress style has changed little until modern times. And if you see pictures of Gandhi, he tried to dress in the old habit of the Indian style, and it was very, very loose-fitting clothing. And again, that was because of India's hot tropical or subtropical climate. That the loose-fitting clothing was, let's face it, a little bit cooler. And having talked about being cooler, I decided to take my jacket off. I'm a little bit warm up here, but anyway. But it kept them a little bit cooler. And of course, in modern times, the people of India have tended to dress more and more like the rest of the world dresses, particularly like the Western world. All right, that's the opening vignette. And yes, somewhere on the test, on one of the tests, there is a question about that. So keep that in mind. Whether you'll see the question or not, I don't know off the top of my head. All right, the Mauryas to the Mughals. I'll tell you this, folks. Don't worry about memorizing the names of those dynasties. They are important. I realize that, but you have a lot to learn, and we're covering 3 chapters in just 3 classes. So, but what I want you to get from this is that after being initially united, when we left India, they were partially united. India has plunged into several centuries of disunity, and the fact is, India has not been able to unite itself to this day. They were united by the British foreigners. The British conquered them all and united them. But otherwise, they've never been able to unite themselves. Now, owing to, your book says it was their philosophy. It was like their philosophies contradicted each other. The one part of their philosophy says they should all obey their government. And another part of the philosophy says we should all be independent. All right, I want to remind you of something. The people of India, the ones who took charge, were descended from the Europeans. And more so perhaps than other peoples on the face of the earth, Europeans had a tradition of limiting the power of their kings, having kings but limiting their power, of being independent. And India, again, had a lot of this tradition of being independent, but they were so independent that they simply could not unite themselves. And this went on for centuries. Your book talks about the Kushan state, the Gupta dynasty, and the Chola kingdom. Don't worry about those names. I mean, those are details that, hey, if you take a course in Indian history later, and you'd have to go to graduate school almost to do that. Or now, we've talked about this. Come next year, this college is going to unite with Georgia State, and they'll be offering 300 and 400 level courses right here, possibly on this campus. I will not be allowed to teach them. I don't have a PhD. I mean, I'll be allowed to teach probably 100 and 200 level courses, but 300 and 400. But some of the 300 and 400 level courses might deal with Indian history, and you'll have to learn all this detail. But that's to come if you are interested in majoring in history. What I do want you to remember, though, was that, as was the case, I mean, they had one dynasty, that dynasty became powerful for a while, then another dynasty come in, another dynasty, the Pallavas, for instance, became powerful, then came the Chola. But then in the 1000s, Islam came in. Islam started out in Arabia in the 600s, and within 400 years, they had conquered Persia, and then once they conquered Persia, they began to make inroads into Pakistan. What is today Pakistan? Now, Islam is there, still there. And the places they took over are today known as Pakistan and Bangladesh. Again, if you look at them, I mean, I'm drawing a simplified map of India. It looks something like this, a triangle. Pakistan is over here. Bangladesh is on this side. At one point, when in 1948, when Britain gave their independence, they made all this country Pakistan. This was East Pakistan, this was West Pakistan. They were 1,000 miles apart. But then East Pakistan broke away, and in 1971, I was in graduate school, became the world's newest nation at that time. They called themselves Bangladesh. But they are Islamic. Pakistan is also Islamic. But India was partially conquered by the Muslims. Now, one reason I think that the Muslims were never able to get to the main part of India, if you know anything about geography, Pakistan is more suited to the Muslim way of fighting, and so is Bangladesh. The rest of India is a land of trees and bushes and hills and valleys, where in the Muslim armies just simply do not do well. Now, I had a student point out, I mean, I get input from a student that the country of Indonesia is an exception. Indonesia is a land of mountains and hills. And the Muslim fighters have been good on horseback. They've also been good at sea. And Indonesia is, after all, an island country. It consists of numerous islands. And the Muslims have been pretty good fighters at sea until Europeans developed better shipping. But anyway, the Muslims poured in, and they conquered part of India, intending to conquer it all, but a few things stopped them. One thing that stopped them was the Mongolians came in. The Mongolians were led first by Genghis Khan. Mongolians. And then after Genghis Khan had passed off the scene, he had supposedly a descendant of his. Now, this man claimed to be descendant, Tamerlane. Sometimes known as Tamer the Lame. But Tamerlane made a lot of headroads into here. But one of his big contributions was the fighting that he did. I mean, he came to the Muslim countries first. He stopped, without meaning to, without intending, he stopped the Muslim advance into India. The Muslims had to turn their attention to him. Then he conquered a lot of the Muslims. And the Muslims then were not able to move on south and finish conquering India. And eventually the Muslim world declined. Now, while all this was going on, the Silk Road that started in China and wound up in the Mediterranean, the Silk Road went through the northern part of India. At times it was a change, but the Silk Road brought a whole lot of trade into India. And a lot of goods on the Silk Road were picked up now. Again, folks, in this case of the Silk Road, remind you, no Chinese person started out in China and went all the way to the Mediterranean. These traders would go maybe a couple hundred miles, drop off their wares at a profit, go back home and pick up wares from the next trader. And then the next trader would carry them maybe a few hundred miles, and he'd drop off and pick up wares and pick up money or whatever. But Romans established several colonies along the western part of India's coast, and this was going on during the days of the Roman Empire. In the 200s, 300s, and even 400s, the Romans were here, and a lot of them stayed, and that made the Indian people have even more like Caucasian-like features, even though they were still dark, but they had Caucasian features. The descendants of the Romans who moved in became dark also, by the same reason the Aryans did, by intermarrying with the local native population. It wasn't the bright Indian sunshine that darkened their skin. No, I'm surprised how many college students don't know this, but have any of you heard that in genetics, acquired characteristics are not inherited? Like if you expose yourself to the sun day in and day out, your children will be just as, I mean, if you're a white person, expose yourself to the sun, your children will be born just as white as you and your wife are. Or if you wind up cutting off your hand. Well, they did some experiments one time with mice, trying to prove that acquired characteristics would be passed on. So they took mice, cut off their tails. They did this for 50 generations, and they measured each generation the length of the mouse's tail. They cut them off at birth. Come generation 51 to 51st generation of mice had tails just as long and just as useful as their ancestors. Acquired characteristics are not inherited. So when these Roman people became black, it was because of intermarrying with the local native population, the same way the Aryans had. Anyway, the Romans had colonies along the western coast. The Silk Road moved in here, and a lot of trade went on, and a lot of Roman gold and silver found its way not only to China, but a lot of it found its way to India, because India was a stopping off place for the Silk Road. A lot of gold and silver from Rome found its way to Rome, and when the gold got to Rome, it never the gold never got back to Rome. And this was to plunge Europe into the Dark Ages, and until Rome stole tons and tons of gold from the American Indians. And then, I have to say it, it did happen. The Europeans stole a lot of gold from the American Indians, and this enabled the Europeans to rise economically again and become prosperous. Now, in addition to, India was doing a lot of trade. Now, in addition, they were going through a period of time what could be called religious struggles. But before during this time, India was undergoing another struggle inside itself, a spiritual struggle. Buddhism was on the rise, and it was threatening Hinduism. Persons who have studied parallel history say that a lot of the religious struggles that India experienced finds its parallels in your study of Christian religion or even Chinese philosophies. All these places in the world, at least the civilizations, went through periods where they went back and forth between one theology and another, and oftentimes when the smoke had cleared, they wound up back at the original theology. In my own lifetime, the year I was born, communism took over China. After communism starved some 25 million people to death. Fast forward to 2015, a lot of Chinese are embracing Confucianism again because communism has not seemingly brought them success. But this is the way human nature is. Anyway, Buddhists built big monasteries. The monasteries would trade, and also the sense of people who lived in the monasteries deprived themselves. That meant everything that they worked for went to the monastery itself. The monasteries often grew wealthy, and they became elaborately decorated, very, very similar to what was going on in Europe. Also, India became like a sacred ground where people from far away visited India, as far away as China, trying to find spiritual guidance. Now, folk, I can understand this because in my generation, yes, believe it or not, I was once as young as you. A lot of my generation went to India, the young men, to find spiritual guidance. And the Indian government finally told American youth, hey, stay home. find your spiritual guidance in your own country, but don't come here, because Americans go there and first thing you do is start complaining like everything, because, I mean, all right, let's face it, those of us who are Americans do not realize we're spoiled rotten. Go to a place like India and find a country with a lot of dirt and a lot of lack of sanitation. And American young people were afraid they'd get diseases, and a lot of them did, particularly tuberculosis and typhoid fever. And finally, the Indian government just said to Americans, hey, stay home. You're not going to be happy here. We're a poor country. But in those days, I mean, the time period, pilgrims from all over the world would come to India, even as far away as China, because they wanted to visit the places where Buddha lived, particularly Buddha, but even the Hindus. This struggle was to go on for a while. Now, on a political, now I have more to say about Buddhism in just a few minutes, but I want to introduce you to a word first. Again, this is the way the book does it so well. The word is feudalism. We're going to see this word again, folk, when we come to European history. The word feudalism, I mean, it hit Europe the biggest. I mean, it was biggest in Europe, but also was found in India and in Japan. It's simply, in one sentence, it means where you have a king, but the king is usually not much more than a figurehead, and all the nobles are independent. The nobility might as well be their own country, their own independent country, because they give lip service to honoring the king, and they say that they're subservient to the king, but in actuality, they're independent of the king. This is basically feudalism. In the case of Europe, you had the king, and under the king were dukes, and there was a Duke of Aquitaine, the Duke of Kent, the Duke of Cornwall, the Duke of Burgundy, all these dukes that were more independent. Then under the dukes were the counts, and it basically a hierarchy of authority. King, and then under him were vassals. If the United States were a feudal society, you might have the king living in Washington, and then there would be the Duke of Georgia, the Duke of Tennessee, the Duke of South Carolina, the Duke of Florida. Each state would be a dukedom. Then in the counts, you'd have the counties ruled by count. The Count Gordon, Count Cobb, Count DeKalb, Count Fulton. I mean, each. But basically, each county would be practically independent of the state also. In other words, the state would be independent of the king for all practical purposes. The counties would be independent of the state. And then under the counties would be various barons ruled over by a shire reeve or a sheriff. Basically, that's feudalism. They had the same thing. They had kings, but the nobility was largely independent. All right, I want to introduce you to that word because, again, you'll see it when we come to chapters 12 and 13. Then Buddhism. Now, back to Buddhism. In the case of Buddha, his followers have had one big problem. What he said was not written down until 200 years after he died. All right, 200 years. How long ago is that? Well, 200 years ago, most of you might have forgotten about it, but James Monroe was president. We don't, well, I mean, historians talk about his administration a lot, but most of us don't remember much about what went on 200 years ago. 200 years is a long time. That meant everybody who heard him speak was dead, everybody who knew everybody who heard him speak was dead, everybody who knew everybody who knew everybody who heard him speak was all dead. It was that long ago, that long had gone by. Well, what happened was, over in this part of India, they said, Buddha said this. Over here, they said, no, Buddha said this. Over here, they said, Buddha said this. Well, Buddha said that. The fact is, we really do not know for sure what Buddha actually said, because his sayings were not written down to 200 years after he died. Some groups get together, and they're pretty well certain that he said this, or maybe said that. But another part of the problem that Buddhism had, though, is it became the religion of the ordinary people. And India is very, very hierarchical and not egalitarian. In other words, they have the caste system. Well, Buddhism started to appeal to the lower caste, especially the untouchables. And this created a problem because a lot of people believed that, particularly the upper class, the upper caste, believed that, hey, we're better than those untouchables. another problem with the untouchables is they're often not highly educated, and their understanding is not all that complex or remote. It's more simple and direct, and you might say concrete. So Buddhism became a divinity rather than a sage. Now here's the difference, folks. A sage is a wise teacher. A divinity is a god. So Buddha started out as a sage. Eventually, among the lower caste at least, he became a god. Went from a wise teacher to a god. And again, this made Buddhism transform. And his teachings became more and more popular, particularly among the ordinary folk. Now, Buddhism taught that all the castes were equal. This was something the Hindus did not like. Well, Buddhism eventually split, as was the case of so many religions. I mean, they eventually split. Islam did, Christianity did. Yes, Buddhism did also. One group believed that you got to nirvana by good deeds and good behavior. Another group believed you got there by devotion. And folks, this reminds me a lot of the conflict in Christianity between faith and works. Some people believing that you get to heaven by doing good deeds, and if your good deeds outweigh your bad. Others believe, no, you get there by faith without regard to works. But the Buddhists went through the same thing. Do we get to nirvana by devotion only, or by good behavior? And also, Buddhism had a lot of rituals that demanded that the ordinary people just didn't have time to perform. The upper leisure classes might have, but the ordinary people had to get up and go to work really early and then work till late and didn't have time for the rituals. So they began to believe that as long as you're devoted, you're okay, never mind whether or not you perform all the rituals. Buddhism went from being a philosophy, which was what it started out, and it was a philosophy, to a religion. In other words, he started out, Buddha was a sage, a great teacher. His people were following what they thought of as a philosophy. Eventually, Buddha became a god, and his beliefs became looked on as a religion. Again, a transformation. But eventually, though, Buddhism declined in India. Now, when I say Buddhism declined in India, Hinduism triumphed in the long run. I mean, they struggled. Buddhism and Hinduism struggled in India, with Hinduism triumphing, but that was not the case in places like Japan, Vietnam, Southeast Asia, what is it, Indonesia, Malaysia. In those countries of Southeast Asia particularly, and Korea and Japan, Buddhism triumphed over most other religions. But it did not in India, where it was founded. And one reason might have been that Buddhism ran counter to the caste system, which is so much a part of India's way of life. Buddhism offended the upper caste. It appealed to the lower caste, but the upper caste were the ones in control. Buddhism offended those. Also, some people say that Buddha denied the existence of the soul, and the Hindus were strongly convinced that everybody had a soul. Buddha did not believe so. And I'll tell you something, Buddha, like Confucius, we're not even really sure if he even believed that there is a God. And he might roll over in his grave if he could learn that his followers now look on him as being God. But anyway, while he was alive, we're not sure he believed if there is a God. But and he denied the existence of the soul, something that the Hindus were certain that did exist. So Buddhism did appeal to the lower untouchables in India, but that appeal was offensive to the higher caste. And eventually the caste system triumphed, which means Hinduism triumphed. Now, Hinduism, though, did not triumph without changes. I mean, competition forces you to change. I mean, I'll tell you a story about American automobiles. For many years, Americans, car companies were putting out crummy cars that would only last 5 years. And one man took them to court over it, and the judge ruled in favor of the person who sued, convinced that Americans were making cars that would only last 5 years, then fall apart. In the meantime, the Japanese and German cars came here, and they sold like hotcakes. And today, Americans are making better cars. If any of you want to elaborate on that, you're welcome to. But you know, what I'm saying is competition. Today, American cars get as few complaints from customers as Japanese and German cars because Americans were forced to do better. And what in theology? The Catholic Church was roaming along by itself. Then along came Protestantism. The Catholic Church had to reform itself. And I would go dare say that the Catholic Church is a better church for it than it would have been had Protestantism never came along. There was competition forces you to improve. Either improve or die. But anyway, Hinduism underwent change. And by undergoing change, they got a lot of people converted back from Buddhism to Hinduism. By Hinduism realized they were going to have to allow all classes to participate in the rituals. Even the untouchables were eventually allowed to participate in Hindu rituals. In fact, the Hindu rituals had originally been reserved only for the higher upper caste, but they changed that to make it available, the rituals available to all castes. It took several generations for Buddhism to decline, but eventually it declined. And today the majority of people in India are Hindu. Now, back to the Islam encroachment. And again, if you're wondering why I'm jumping around, the book does. So, the Islam encroachment, Islam arrived similar to the way it arrived in Persia. Islam arrived in Persia at the time Persia was disunited. So, or actually, no, Persia was weakened. Persia was weakened by the wars with the Byzantine Empire. So, Islam arrived at the time that the Persian Empire was weakened. So, they conquered Persia. Then Islam arrived in India at a time when India was disunited. So Islam then was able to conquer a big portion of northern India. What helped the Muslims? The Muslims had superior weapons, and also the Muslims fought from horseback. The Indian people, the Indian soldiers, oftentimes fought from elephants. Now, if you can imagine being on the back of an elephant, you're pretty high off the ground, and if you fall, it almost means certain death, especially if you fall and have anything on that resembles armor or a shield. It almost means certain death. A man can fall from a horse and survive. You can hardly fall from the back of an elephant and survive. But the horse was a much faster animal than an elephant. The horse was more maneuverable than the elephant. Speed is very important in warfare. If you're faster than the enemy, that means you give battle when you choose. If you think you can't win, you can always run and the enemy can't catch you. But then, if you decide to give battle to the enemy, he can't run away from you because you're faster than he is. So, again, the horse was a better weapon. It proved to be a better place to fight from, a horseback, than an elephant back. So the Indian armies were slower. Indian leaders were often quarreling among themselves, and at this time the Muslims who came to India were united. So Islam made quite a few inroads at first. Then I mentioned how the Mongolians, led first by Genghis Khan, then led by Tamerlane, slowed down a lot of the Islamic inroads into India. And eventually, the people of India learned how to handle the Muslims, keep them at bay, but they never could drive the Muslims out of Pakistan or out of Bangladesh. Now, did the Islams resort to forced conversions? I've had students from India who insist that yes, they did. Your book downplays that. Your book says that some rulers perhaps did. and other rulers definitely did not. I think your authors are trying to work hard to promote peace between the Muslims and the West. But even though your book was written before the rise of ISIS and before, and we know ISIS is definitely practicing forced conversions. But anyway, according to some students I've had, a lot of the Pakistanis were forced to convert. But then the Muslim world declined. They started fighting among themselves, and a new threat came in to India that the Indians did not realize the threat at first. The Portuguese came over, basically the Europeans arrived. Now in 1498, 6 years after Columbus, a Portuguese sailor named Vasco da Gama sailed around Africa, and he arrived in India. Now, let's face it, folk. By the time these Portuguese arrived in India, their ship was ragged, dirty, their sailors were dirty, infested with scurvy caused by lack of vitamin C. And these poor, ragged Portuguese did not appear to pose any threat at all to India. The Portuguese were well received and they were welcomed, and they bought back, once they traded their goods to India, brought back to Europe a whole bunch of spices, and the Europeans came in droves. Now, I'm going to jump ahead of the story a little bit. The threat the Europeans posed was in the late 1700s. Now, I hope, folks, that all of you know this much about our history. In the late 1700s, the British Crown lost 13 colonies in North America, and Georgia was one of the colonies. I mean, hopefully, I'm not going to ask for sure, hopefully all of you heard it. The European, Great Britain lost 13 colonies in North America. Well, to get back some revenue from the lost colonies, India went over, pardon me, it's early enough. To get back like Great Britain went to India, and they conquered India. And one of the men that Great Britain sent to India to conquer India was Lord Cornwallis. I want to have any of you ever heard that name, Cornwallis? What did he do? He's the one who, he was a general who surrendered to the Americans at Yorktown. He surrendered to George Washington. His surrender ended the Revolutionary War. Well, after he went home in defeat, the British apparently did not blame him for the defeat. I mean, after all, fighting the Americans and the French combined was too much. So they sent him to India, and he and Robert Clive, and well, a bunch of others, they conquered India. That's jumping ahead of the story a little bit, but India was destined to be united finally under the control of the British, but that's later. All right. Now, there are some differences between Islam and the Hindus. The Indian concepts of government called for a lot more freedom and liberty. The Muslim concept of government called for absolute total submission to the state. And this meant that the Muslims had a little bit of a difficult time ruling India. The relationship between the Muslims and the Indians was mostly a relationship of conqueror and conquered, with the Muslims being the conquerors and the Indian people being the conquered. There were some traditions that the Indians had that the Muslims found offensive. For instance, Indian art. Indian art appears to be vulgar to Islam. I mean, Islam insists on extreme modesty for women. And any of you who ever looked at Indian art knows that Indian art oftentimes pictures women in a far, I'll just say, less than modest light, and I'll leave it at that. And Muslims often find Indian art to be offensive, or Hindu art to be offensive. Also, Islam was monotheistic, consisting that there's only one God. Hinduism is polytheistic. They have at least 1 million gods. Each family has its own god. Each tribe and each local village has its own god. They are different. Islam is egalitarian. They believe everybody has equal access to Allah. Islam, therefore, has no priest. Hinduism has lots of priests. Hinduism is hierarchical. You know, they believe that there's different levels of humans. Some humans are higher than others. Islam insists that all people are equal. Another difference, Muslims eat beef, Hindus do not. Now, having said this, I mean, I spent 27 years at Lockheed, and Lockheed, in order to try to get these foreign countries to buy their airplanes, we'd hire people from foreign countries, and one day Lockheed hired a Hindu man and a Pakistani man and put them both in the same department. At first, the two men hated each other. But then they realized that here in America, they had more in common with each other than either one of them had with Americans. And they wound up becoming fast friends. Unfortunately, the Hindu man died of cancer at about the age of 50. The Muslim man went on to become department manager for a while. He was department manager last time I was there. He might be retired by now. But they wound up getting along because they realized that here in America, they were more alike than either one of them was alike to the rest of Americans. But they clashed over the issue of eating beef with, again, the Muslims insisting it was all right to eat beef, with the Hindus saying, no, it's wrong. The Hindus eventually learned that horses were better weapons than elephants, or better to fight from than elephants. So the Hindu leaders, the Rajas, the kings, whatever you call them, the Hindu nobility began to accumulate horses and breed horses for battle, with the result was that they were able to keep the Muslims at bay. Now, some Hindu men did copy some facets of Islam. Hindu men saw that Muslim men kept their wives hidden away in hidden seclusion and wouldn't let them come out. So a lot of Hindu men started copying the same thing. I mean, folks, this is in your book, and in no way am I saying it's right, but nevertheless, I mean, this went on. They'd see the Muslims men do that, so they did it. Now, the other tradition of Hindu women burning themselves to death when their husbands died, building up a big fire and throwing themselves on the fire, Muslims did not change that practice very much. I mean, again, Muslims did not regard women as being very high anyway. It was left to the British, who came later, to try to get the Hindu people to quit doing this. The practice of child marriages changed very little, where the Indian men would marry young girls as young as 9 years old. That changed very little under Muslim rule. Again, a lot of the Muslim men did this themselves. But when the British took over, the rest of the world told the British, hey, you've got to stop this. So, but the two groups did not get along very well. And they still do not get along very well to this day. They're suspicious of each other. And India and Pakistan is in a state of constant threat of war. And India accuses Pakistan of terrorism. This goes on to this day. All right. With that, I'll take my leave from India and go to Southeast Asia. Again, it's the same chapter, folks, same chapter. Southeast Asia consists of two components: the mainland and the islands. The mainland is Vietnam, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia. Your book now talks about Myanmar. Anyway, the islands consist of what is present-day Indonesia and the Philippines. Now, this region of Southeast Asia reminds me a little bit of the United States, and it is a melting pot of many, many different peoples and cultures. Who moved into Southeast Asia, we don't even know for sure, but apparently a lot of people from India moved there, people from China moved there, people from the mainland moved into the islands. Southeast Asia has more languages than any other place of its size in the world, and more that's genetic group. I mean, if you try to study its DNA is a hodgepodge of all kinds of DNA. Its religions, it's a hodgepodge of religions also, with Confucius, Hinduism, mainly Buddhism, and all these religions forming and Islam. Oh yes, Islam. The main religions, again, the main one, Buddhism, Hinduism, Confucianism, and Islam, all of them making a lot of headway in that region. Water is abundant, rainfall is predictable, the climate is predictable. A lot of the region is mountain. It's not just the sea that has separated these people, islands or whatever, very islands separated, but also on each of these islands are very, very tall, tall mountains. And that's the same way when you go to Southeast Asia. The valleys are separated by very, very tall mountains, and the people moved around by traveling through the valleys, because mountain travel is very, very difficult. The mountains are tall, the mountains are steep, and makes travel difficult. No one in all of its history has ever been able to unite all of Southeast Asia into one kingdom. Now, the only reason Indonesia is united today was the Dutch came in, and the Dutch conquered them and kept them united for some 300 years, and after World War II, the Dutch gave them up, and they still have been united to this day. But Southeast Asia has never been united under one central government, and from one of our conquerors, even a man like Alexander the Great, probably, and even Genghis Khan, probably could not have united them. There's too many problems with language barrier, mountains, seas, and they kept apart. The people who moved in probably came in waves, with the first wave probably coming in about 2500 BCE, then another wave coming in 1,000 years later. They came in waves. They came from India and China, mostly from Asia, probably not very many from Africa. They had contact with the outside world through trade. Particularly, mostly Indian merchants would come in by sea and trade with them. And the Indian merchants spread Hinduism among them, and then Buddhism. The people these people had a tendency to degenerate to tribal people, become tribal peoples and uncivilized. To these egalitarian type people, Hinduism had more of an appeal than hierarchical Buddhism, than hierarchical Hinduism did. Also, the local peoples had adopted a form of animism. In other words, they started out as all primitive peoples do. I say practically all primitive peoples embraced some form of animism, or nature worship, spirit worship, believing everything is God. The trees are God, the fish is God, and every animal is a god in itself, and they perform an apology every time they have to kill an animal for food. They perform a ceremony called an apology. But they realized the superiority of the Indian civilization, so they tried to copy it, and a lot of them became civilized themselves after seeing what the Indian people had to offer in the way of civilization. Now, eventually, between the years 600 and 1400, more civilizations grew up. The civilizations tended to grow up along the coastlines, in other words, where they could have trade and have foreign influence. Deep inside was jungle, and in the jungles, these peoples tended to remain animistic. But some people would leave the jungle and go to the cities and become what you might say civilized. Now, one of the cities that we find deep in the jungle of what is today Cambodia was a city called Angkor. I myself did not know of Angkor Wat's existence until one of my friends at work bought in National Geographic, where the whole magazine was devoted to Angkor Wat. Folks, picture this scenario. A European man, well, first of all, Europeans have been told a rumor that there was a really, really big city located deep in the jungle. Of course, Europeans, when they encountered these people here at all, some of them may have heard that the American Indians told stories of Cibola, lost cities of Cibola that were glistening and bright, and the streets were made of gold. And also in the state of Florida, the Indians told of Fountain of Youth, and Ponce de Leon believed it. And Ponce de Leon, every time he came to a puddle or a pool, he would stoop down, his men would watch, see, is he going to turn younger? No, he never did get younger. There was no fountain of youth that we know of. But basically, we heard the story that there was a big, big city in the jungle. But one day a European was exploring a jungle and all of a sudden came to this clearing, and there in the clearing was a huge, huge metropolis with nobody in it. The tiger peeked out from a window, looked at him, but then the tiger disappeared back. A 6-foot-long black snake slithered across the street. He ignored the black snake, and the black snake ignored him. He went around and explored, marked the location on his map where the city was, went back and told his fellow Europeans what he'd seen, and they came back with a large number and explored the city. And then they began to try to piece together, well, who built this city and what happened to it. Eventually, here's a story they pieced together. Angkor Wat was once the capital of the land of Cambodia, and it was indeed a bright city. But over time, the empire began to be whittled away from, and these cities only can exist if they can collect a lot of tax money from the surrounding countryside. Well, foreigners conquered the surrounding countryside, and eventually, the people of Angkor, one day, just all of them, the ones that were left, got up and abandoned their city of Angkor and went out and never came back. But that would happen 400 years ago. Now, what went wrong inside? Well, okay, here's a story, folks. And we find a lot of abandoned cities, sunken cities underground. The Sumerian cities all abandoned. Angkor Wat decayed from within before the barbarians took over from without. Now, this is the classic case, folk, of you have a civilization. This civilization is surrounded by barbarians. The civilization at first is the master, but then the civilization crumbles from within, and the barbarians from without come in and take over. What went wrong? Well, this is something that I've read in a National Geographic article that I've never read since, and probably nobody wants to comment on. But what I read in a National Geographic article in 1983 was that the kings of Angkor Wat at first were Hindu. And as Hindu kings, they were energetic, they were conquerors, they were avid tax collectors, they enforced their laws. Then, as their people began to convert to Buddhism, the kings converted to Buddhism also, and Buddhism emphasizes accept what is, what will be, whatever the gods decree, that's what you have to come to terms with. Their kings became less energetic, their kings became more passive. Their neighbors, and again, if any of you are Buddhist, and take offense at it, I'm not going to apologize. This is what the National Geographic article said. You can argue with it if you want to. I won't argue back, but you can argue with it. But basically, Buddhism made their kings less assertive, less energetic, more contemplative and more meditative, spending more time with ritual, less time tending to the state. And with all that neglected, the empire began to crumble, the city began to crumble. And of course, the city was made of stone, and if any of you know anything about stone buildings, they after a while will crumble, and they're very, very difficult to shore up and repair. The stones, as the heat and cold comes in, the stones expand and contract, expand, and then they crack, then they start to chip away and they crumble. And very, very difficult to repair after a time. And eventually the whole city was abandoned. Deep in the jungle, declined. Oh yeah, when Angkor was abandoned, the people of Angkor built another city near Phnom Penh. Folks, this is another reason why Babylon was abandoned. The people of Babylon built the city of Baghdad. When you build your city of heavy, heavy, heavy rocks, and the rocks crumble, and you can't repair it, sometimes you find it cheaper to just simply move out and start all over with building your city of something else beside rock. Again, I can pretty well guarantee I won't be around to see it, but when this building gets old, they'll just simply take a bulldozer to it, level it off, and put another building in its place that will be built of materials that maybe don't even exist now. It's just simply what happens when times decay. And by the time Europeans discovered it, it had been abandoned for 4 centuries. The people who took over were the Burmans, but the Burmans, you might wonder, why didn't the Burmans live in the city? Hey, nobody wants to live in it now. The city is dangerous. The buildings are too dangerous to live in. You run the risk of the buildings just toppling over on top of you while you sleep, or any time the slight earthquake can bring them down. I mean, the stones no longer fit together as tightly as they once did, and nobody wants to repair them anymore. Malaysia is consists of a bunch of islands. For a while they were united. They spent a lot of time fighting among themselves. I mean, basically just simply know Malaysia. Eventually the Malaysian formed what the nation that we today call Indonesia. They were united finally by the Dutch, but they could not unite themselves. Malaysia is still, I'll call it Malaysia because that's the old name for it, still influenced by India. Their trade consists of a whole lot of spices, rice, nuts. Religiously, they started out as animistic, but they moved from animism to Hinduism and Buddhism, with Buddhism becoming dominant. Now, that's interesting. I mean, that's what your book said. That's interesting because today, their official religion is Islam. I want to say this about the modern history of Indonesia. I mean, I met some Indonesian students, both men and women, when I was in college. When I was in college, communism said it was going to take over Indonesia, and the communists moved in. The Indonesian people rose up against the communists and killed, they got rid of the communists without any help from the United States, because remember, they killed 100,000 communists, and communism died in Indonesia. And then to the surprise of everyone, Islam took over, and that was surprising because most of the people were either Hindu or Buddhist, but the Buddhists were not aggressive enough to move in, and the Hindus did not either. So who took over? Well, the Islamic took over, and they are in charge still. All right. Basically, to sum up, Southeast Asia is a melting pot. It reminds me of the United States. Unlike the United States, though, the United States, everybody spoke a common language. Let's say, put it this way. The United States was a melting pot. Got people from China, got people from India, got people from Asia, got people from Africa, and especially Europe, and the local Native American Indians. And all these people contributed to blending in their culture, but eventually all of them had to learn English. So we had a common language, at least English, and most of them, the people who lived here, have eventually learned English. That's a controversial point, I know, but we had the same language and had a lot in common as far as beliefs and liberties and individual freedoms. And how much longer that will last, I don't know. But in Southeast Asia, they did not have a common language and did not have common beliefs. And they were separated by oceans and tall, tall mountains that made unity very, very difficult. All right. That sums up most of what I remember from Southeast Asia and India. Now, I'll say this, don't be surprised if when you come back here on Monday, I will go back and cover some ground that I left off, because there's probably some stuff I've left out that I really wanted to include. However, we have about 10 minutes left, and I want to start the next chapter, China. The last time we visited China was in chapter 5, and to my regret, I forgot all about it. I'm going to be honest, I forgot about chapter 5. In chapter 5, we ran into the Han Dynasty. This dynasty was to rule China for 400 years, from 200 BCE. Now, these are dates to 200 CE, 200 years before Christ by our time, 200 years after by our time. The Han Dynasty. Now, the Han Dynasty's fate largely paralleled the fate of Europe in this time period, Europe was united, China was united. Now, fast forward, both Europe and China declined in the 200s, 300s, and 400s. Europe split up and never got back together again. To this day, Europe is still divided into several countries. China split up for a while, but they got back together. Both Europe and China declined. Europe's population declined greatly, as did China's, and that was a test question. I have to apologize for giving because I didn't go over it before, but I'm going over it now. And folk, anyone want to guess what I think caused the population of the Northern Hemisphere to decline? Anyone want to guess? In both Europe and China, and India too. What's that? I see. Yeah, maybe not that extreme, but basically the climate is likely to have cooled. Now, you go back that far, you have a harder time proving it. Now, we can prove it in the 1600s. In the 1600s, the climate cooled and it carried off millions of people in India, China, and Europe. That was about the time our country, the United States, was starting to be colonized. And when Europeans began to come over in droves in the 1600s, I'm talking about in America, all right, let me tell you. One reason that Europeans were able to take over what is today the United States and Canada, when the Europeans arrived, there were hardly any Indians left to oppose them. When the Plymouth colony arrived in Massachusetts, they found no Indians there. Finally, an Indian man walked into the camp, and he said, "I speak English." His name was Squanto. Some of you may have heard the story. He had been captured by the British and held for some 10 years, and finally the British felt sorry for him and ordered him to be sent back home. He was sent back home and found all of his family dead. But there were no, so basically what I'm saying is the population in North America also declined. So you have the population declining greatly in North America and Europe. That was in 1600, and it was caused, we know, by the Little Ice Age. Now, we can't quite prove it back that far, but folk is highly suspicious. Anyway, the climate appears to have cooled. The Han Dynasty declined. And after the Han Dynasty, China went into a period of chaos called the Era of Six Dynasties. That is, at least 6 dynasties were ruling at one time. Not 6 dynasties, one after another. China was split into at least 6 different nations. These nations were constantly at war with each other, but also they were pathetically inferior to what China had been before. So they just, hey, folk, at the same time, I mean, all right, some people study comparative history. All right, compare. Europe. In the 200s, Europe began to decline. By the 400s, Europe was fragmented, scattered, several different countries. India, we just talked about India. After being united around the 300s and 400s, India was scattered and fragmented and never did unite again until the British came and united. India went under as far as unity, declined. China, same thing, same time period. Had 6 dynasties that were at war with each other. It wasn't until around the 700s or 800s that China began to revive. Now, unlike Europe, though, the Chinese continued to build, and they built and built until in the 1300s, as far as we know, he was the first. A European family visited China in the 1300s and came back telling all kinds of stories about Chinese history. This man's name was Marco Polo. And Marco Polo influenced Columbus. Columbus read Marco Polo's book. But Columbus said, now, since the earth is round, maybe I can, but that's a different story. But maybe I could reach China by water instead of going across the overland route. Anyway, the Chinese and Indians, like the Indians and like the Europeans, looked back in their history books and the Europeans looked back and said, oh, if we could only rebuild the Roman Empire. And the Catholic Church tried for centuries to rebuild it. And most recently, Mussolini, who was a little bit before my time. Mussolini died in 1945, 4 years before I was born. But Mussolini tried to rebuild the Roman Empire. He failed. Before that, the Catholic Church tried several times to go to the Roman Empire. It failed, but they looked back. The people of India looked back to the glory days of the old dynasties, the Gupta dynasty, the Maurya dynasty, and the Chinese looked back to the glorious days of the Han dynasty, and they thought, if we can only copy that. There's a universal truth, folks, that the past can never be restored. But some people have acted like it could. Anyway, the Chinese began to stabilize in the 700s, 600s, and by the 1300s, China was the richest country in the world. By the 1300s, yes. When Marco Polo visited in the 1300s, he came back to Europe talking of a magnificent kingdom. Marco Polo became a servant in the court of the great Kublai Khan, the great king of China. Kublai Khan was a grandson of Genghis Khan. And Kublai Khan was the ruler of China under the Yuan dynasty, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And Marco Polo described China as a land of glistening towers, bright cities, perhaps exaggerated. And a lot of Europeans had heard of China. They looked on it as being a land of magic, or a land that was almost otherworldly, different from them, which in a lot of ways it was. Folk, throughout the 700s, the 800s, 900s, 1000s, 1100s, 1200s, 1300s, 1400s, the Chinese were far, far ahead of Europe. But like Islam, they stood still, like the rabbit in a race. The rabbit went to sleep while the turtle kept on crawling. Once the turtle got past him, the turtle really flew, but that was something else. They simply, hey, I've listed to you, and I'll close this, some of the inventions the Chinese made. The Chinese invented the printing press, gunpowder, the rudder, the compass, the movable sail. Folk, with these inventions, they could have overspread the whole globe. They could have conquered the world. What happened? The philosophers took over. Oh, they had the banking system, and again, folks, I can't emphasize how important it is to have banks. With the banking system, they should have developed commerce and industry, but they looked down on their craftsmen. They looked down on the merchants as being greedy gobblers and, just very greedy. And so they discouraged people from going into the field of craftsmanship or merchantship. And the result was they fell by the wayside. Now that's not to say, now right at this very moment, the United States is having some tense moments with China, folks. You might be aware. And the Chinese just said yesterday, we're not afraid of the United States, we're not afraid of a war with the United States. So they're not afraid of taking us on. And guess who owns a substantial portion of American debt? Who knows? China. Most of the goods you see at Walmart stores, where they come from? And when I want to buy a $35 or $40 transistor, I have to tell you where I go to get it. Not like I go to eBay and get the same $30 transistor for $5. And guess where it comes from?